A pale blue envelope trembled in the Georgia wind, taped to Marshall Quinn's wooden gate, just below the Ella's Wild Garden sign. It fluttered against the weathered wood like it was trying to fly away, held only by a strip of tape and something meaner in intent. Marshall stepped slowly down the front path, coffee mug in hand, boots brushing against creeping thyme and wintergreen, his gait steady but soft as the ground under the dogwood trees. He didn't need to read it to know who it was from. Not many folks around here use colored paper for anything but warnings. He peeled the envelope off with the same motion he used to lift letters from Ella's side of the dresser drawer, deliberate, careful not to disturb what couldn't be replaced. The wind caught the bottom corner as he opened it. One page, typed, with bold lines and sharper phrases. Notice of exterior noncompliance. He read aloud in a dry whisper, scanning each line. Unpainted lattice. Excessive vine growth. Non-conforming bird feeders. A flicker of something almost like amusement tugged at the edge of his mouth. Bird feeders, he repeated. Unconforming. He folded the page, clean and square, then slid it into the side pocket of his flannel jacket. The air smelled like loam and old pine, that lingering richness that comes after the last spring rain has settled. A squirrel chattered from the fence post, tail flicking like a metronome, then scampered down into a tangle of ivy and mint. Marshall stepped back onto the porch, which creaked beneath him like an old friend shifting in its sleep. He settled into his rocking chair, the one with the carved initials on the armrest, and set the mug on the rail. From this spot, he could see Ella's old planter boxes in full bloom, lavender, basil, and marigold all pushing up defiantly against the edges. She'd loved the chaos of it, how the garden refused to conform. He reached behind the rocker and pulled out a battered folder labeled Ella's Stuff and HOA Nonsense. Inside, letters dating back a decade, some scolding, some polite, all signed by the same invisible hand of uniformity. He slid the newest one in without a word. That morning had started like most others. The Sweet Magnolia diner still smelled of bacon grease and lemon cleaner. Brayton was in his booth by the corner window, talking about how his wife now trimmed their bushes with a ruler because of last month's HOA update. Said mulch can't look too mulchy, whatever the hell that means, he grumbled over his biscuit. The waitress, Pearl, topped off Marshall's cup with a wink. Careful, she said. The HOA's cracking down on non-uniform flowerbeds again. He'd chuckled then, paid in cash, and left $1 tip folded into a triangle, something Ella always did, so it didn't get lost in the syrup. Now, he watched the street as a shadow passed overhead. A faint mechanical hum followed, and when he glanced up, he saw it, a drone, hovering just above the sycamore. Its lens blinked once, twice, then tilted downward toward the porch. Marshall didn't wave. He didn't scowl either. He just lifted his mug and took another sip, holding its weight like a polite insult. From the sidewalk, a man in a beige HOA polo shirt stood with a tablet. He snapped a photo, nodded once, and turned away, disappearing behind the trimmed hedge of the Myers house. Marshall didn't move. The chimes swayed lazily above him, Ella's wind chimes, bought from a flea market off Route 78, still singing despite a bent rod and a missing note. Inside the house, the air was cool and quiet. The same old clock ticked slightly off-tempo in the kitchen. On the counter, a bowl of peaches softened under the afternoon sun, their skin beginning to wrinkle. He placed the mug in the sink, wiped his hands on the dish towel that hadn't matched the kitchen since 1992, and stood for a moment staring at the calendar. March was nearly gone. Another season coming. Another round of trimming, reseeding, and fending off letters that pretended to be polite. The cordless phone waited in its cradle, blinking red once, then still. He walked over, picked it up, and dialed. They came for her wind chimes. Now it's my vines. Fine. He walks inside and calls someone we don't hear. Lucy's truck arrived covered in stickers, grow native, ask me about milkweed, and be civil. It rolled up the gravel lane with a gentle grumble, a few petals clinging to the windshield and a small basket of seedlings swaying from the passenger seat. The truck came to a full stop just past the garden gate, where a sprawl of yarrow and wild onion brushed the tires like welcoming hands. From the porch, Marshall watched with a tired sort of curiosity, the same look he'd had the first time she sent him an email with no greeting, just a PDF and a note that said, "Look into this." Lucy climbed out in cut-off jeans and a canvas field vest, her boots coated in what might have been 3 counties worth of red clay. She stretched, popped the driver's door shut with her hip, and smiled up at her grandfather. "Too natural," she said, eyeing the folded letter in his hand. "That's what they wrote. Like nature's the problem now." Marshall lifted the letter slightly, then shook his head. "It's a new category. We used to call it spring." Inside, the kitchen was filled with the scent of scrambled eggs and pine mulch tracked in from the back door. The morning light filtered through gingham curtains, casting golden squares on the linoleum floor. Lucy dropped her bag by the table, snagged a muffin, and poured herself a glass of tea. "Sweet or unsweet?" Marshall asked. She raised an eyebrow. "Grandpa. Just checking." They ate side by side, sharing mostly silence and steam. Lucy glanced now and then at the edges of the letter. Marshall didn't unfold it again, he didn't need to. Instead, he nodded toward the window. "You think they'll make me cut down the jessamine?" "They might try," she said. "But they'll regret it." Marshall snorted. "You always this dramatic, or is it just with vines?" She leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Remember when I did that high school project? The milkweed planter box?" "Vaguely. You won something, didn't you?" "Local youth grant. It went to seeds and a sandwich." Marshall smiled. "A wise investment." Lucy reached into her bag and pulled out a flyer, creased, dog-eared, and still damp from travel. "The Georgia Wild Yards program. It's legit. If your garden qualifies as a pollinator habitat, state law protects it under certain codes, including against neighborhood ordinance complaints." Marshall took the paper, scanned it. "That butterfly group your grandma used to talk about?" Lucy nodded. "Same movement. Different tools. They've got teeth now." Carl passed by on the sidewalk just then, holding a watering can and a sandwich in opposite hands. He paused long enough to catch sight of Lucy's bumper stickers and raised his eyebrows in amused approval. She waved back. "That Carl?" she asked. "Still lives across the street," Marshall said. "Still convinced rain barrels are hydrologic anarchy." Lucy laughed. "Well, he's not wrong." They moved to the living room after breakfast. Lucy rifled through an old drawer beside the hutch where Ella used to keep spare keys and birdseed coupons. Papers slid around until one caught her eye, a folded land survey marked in pencil and annotated in handwriting too precise to be Marshall's. "This yours?" He took one look and exhaled. "Ella." She had notes on everything. Plants, fence lines, the soil pH under the dogwood. Lucy smiled as she read. Goldenrod, columbine, bee-balm. She was building a habitat before it had a name. She'd have signed up for this program before they finished typing it, Marshall said. But the HOA? They didn't appreciate flowers without symmetry. She'd say symmetry was overrated. Marshall looked out the window, where the wind shifted just enough to ring the old wind chimes. Mrs. Lowe arrived shortly after noon, bringing a thermos of ginger tea and a worried expression. "They fine me for letting my rosemary get scraggly." "It's medicinal," she said, pouring tea into mismatched mugs. "Maybe this yard will be the one to stop them." Lucy listened carefully, asked a few questions, and promised to include Mrs. Lowe's story in the application. By late afternoon, she was back on the porch, laptop open, typing steadily. A tab labeled Nature Conservancy, Application Portal, blinked beside a folder titled Ella's Garden, Historical Notes. Birds hopped along the railing, occasionally peering over her shoulder. Marshall brought her a glass of iced tea and sat in the rocker beside her. They looked out over the garden, the basil reaching skyward, the daisies flaring defiantly, and the hum of bees working through it all like clockmakers in a field of gold. Lucy leaned back, grinning. "We're not just fighting back. We're registering a nature reserve." A golf cart convoy pulls up, 3 HOA board members, all in beige and all frowning at Marshall's porch. They disembarked in a line, stiff-backed and clipboard-armed, like a beige brigade sent to defend decorative mulch and regulation color swatches. The first to step onto the walkway was a woman in kitten heels and a pearl-button blazer, her smile composed with such care it left no room for kindness. Lucy leaned over toward Marshall and whispered, "Smile. They expect outrage. Give them civility and compost." Marshall's mouth twitched. He stood, slow but steady, and let the porch settle beneath him with its familiar creak. "Good morning," Charlene Denning began. Her tone suggested the opposite. She scanned the yard, eyes pausing on the tangled trellis and the buzzing activity around the coneflowers. "We're conducting a visual compliance assessment. Please don't interrupt while we take observations." Lucy stood beside her grandfather, arms crossed, phone camera already rolling. "Just recording for transparency," she said lightly. Charlene's gaze flicked to the phone, then back to Marshall. "According to HOA standards, natural overgrowth must not exceed 10% of total frontage area. Your property shows signs of non-compliant density. Also," she gestured toward the feeder, "bird feeders must be squirrel-resistant and neutral-colored. That one appears whimsical." Marshall looked at the little ceramic feeder hanging from the dogwood branch. It was shaped like a lighthouse, hand-painted in weathered blue and white, chipped at the base where a squirrel had once won the battle. "I always figured birds preferred color," he said. Behind Charlene, Mr. Hollins scribbled something on his pad. He offered no expression, but his eyes lingered on the base of the feeder longer than the others. The third board member, whose name Marshall couldn't recall, seemed more preoccupied with adjusting his collar than with counting flowers. "We expect visual harmony," Charlene continued, turning back to the porch. "And community cohesion. Exceptions set precedent, Mr. Quinn. This garden, as charming as it may appear to some, poses a threat to neighborhood continuity." Marshall took a moment. "Lemonade?" he asked. Charlene blinked. "Excuse me?" "Fresh squeezed. Bit of honey. My granddaughter makes it." Only Mr. Hollins accepted the offer. He nodded once, murmured, "Thank you," and accepted the mason jar with both hands. Charlene, tight-lipped, turned to walk the perimeter, shoes crunching across the path of crushed oyster shell Ella had laid a decade ago. A squirrel darted down from the roof and scolded them all in a shrill staccato. Lucy followed the group at a polite distance, camera phone still steady. She didn't speak again until they returned to the front walk. "We'll be issuing a formal notice," Charlene said. 5 days to comply." They left in the same quiet fanfare they arrived with, golf cart humming like an overfed lawnmower. The breeze behind them carried the scent of time and defiance. Back on the porch, Lucy dropped into the rocker and let it creak once before swinging open her laptop. She pulled up the Conservancy portal and resumed uploading the final images, scanned pages of Ella's handwritten plant lists, diagrams, and an annotated map of what she once titled Legacy Pollinator Beds. Carl stopped by not long after, walking his mutt of a dog and eating something that looked like banana bread from a napkin. "Heard the beige squad was on patrol," he said, nodding at the departing golf cart. "They were thorough," Lucy said. "Even critiqued the bird feeder." Carl squinted at it. "Whimsical's a compliment. Let me grab my scanner, I've got time to help with uploads." Together, they worked until mid-afternoon. Carl scanned, Lucy labeled, and Marshall brought out a tray of shortbread and sweet tea without comment. The light from the window caught the fine lines in Ella's sketches, each arrow, each Latin name penned in her neat, deliberate hand. When the last file was in place and the cursor hovered over the green button marked Submit, Lucy looked at Marshall. He gave a slow, sure nod. She clicked. The confirmation screen blinked, application received, Georgia Wild Yards Tier 2 evaluation pending. That evening, the air was unusually still. No breeze stirred the chimes. Marshall stepped onto the porch with a book he didn't plan to read and a half-full mug he didn't plan to finish. He saw it then, a second letter taped to the gate, the tape already starting to curl. He walked over slowly, peeled it free, read the heading, and folded it in silence. No surprise. No sound. He placed it under the smooth flat rock beside Ella's wind chimes, anchoring it like a paperweight on her memory. That evening, a second letter appears, final warning, 5 days to comply. Marshall places it under a rock beside Ella's chimes. Dr. Kamal knelt near the back fence, brushing soil aside. You've got wild columbine here. That's rare this far south. The morning was warm and golden, one of those April Saturdays in Georgia where everything blooms at once, dogwood blossoms hanging like lanterns, milkweed nodding in the breeze, wild jasmine curling along the trellis. A few bees hovered low near the fence line, drawn to the early scent of marigolds and creeping thyme. Lucy crouched beside the botanist, scribbling notes into a field log already creased at the edges. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and smelled faintly of chamomile and sunscreen. Marshall stood a few feet back, hands in his pockets, watching the exchange with the quiet interest of someone who knew every square inch of the yard but had never seen it through scientific eyes. Dr. Kamal Ramirez worked with careful intention. Her sun hat shadowed a calm, focused face, and her hiking vest held everything from specimen bags to a tiny magnifier clipped near the collar. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone used to listening before speaking. Milkweed's healthy, she murmured, pointing to a thick stalk clustered with leaves. And that caterpillar? Monarch. They've been declining, but this one's fat enough to pupate soon. Marshall followed her gaze and spotted the inch-long creature curled like punctuation under the green. He said nothing but smiled faintly. Lucy leaned over and gestured toward a rusted trellis wrapped in clematis. That was my grandma's favorite spot. She used to tuck seed packets in the soil with little notes. Any still around? Some, Lucy said, walking toward the gourd birdhouses strung along the fence. She labeled them too. Sure enough, a faded tag hung from a branch, its ink still legible despite the years, for the finches, D. Dr. Kamal gently pulled a small camera from her vest. This kind of layering, multiple species at different heights, overlapping bloom cycles, it's a textbook example of pollinator support. And that structure? She pointed to a raised bed near the porch. Looks like intentional native clustering. You didn't plant that recently, did you? Marshall shook his head. She did. About 20 years ago, give or take a few forgotten birthdays. Kamal nodded, clearly impressed. I've walked properties with grant funding that didn't hold up this well. From the porch, Carl adjusted his camera quietly, recording a slow pan across the garden. He didn't say much, just a thumbs up every now and then as he captured shots of monarchs in flight and bees sinking into golden petals. Lucy returned with a printout of species names. Kamal reviewed it, marking a few with check marks. You're eligible for preliminary Tier 2 consideration. That means the state will hold off on any compliance enforcement until we complete our review. Could take a few weeks. Marshall exhaled, low and slow. That mean they can't fine me for having too many daisies? Kamal smiled. Not until they define what too many means. The moment was quiet for a beat, and then Lucy spoke. We're calling it Harland Legacy Habitat. She never asked for recognition, but this feels right. Kamal nodded, slipping the species list into her satchel. This yard tells a better story than most grants I read. She left just before noon, promising a report within the week. Lucy stood at the gate long after the car disappeared down the gravel drive. The tea had long gone cool. Birds chirped from the dogwood branches, unbothered by human concerns. That evening, Lucy sat on the porch with her laptop balanced on her knees. Carl had already uploaded the video snippets, and the Harland Legacy Habitat folder was nearly full: maps, photos, handwritten plant tags, scanned surveys. She clicked submit on the follow-up application just as the first evening crickets began to sing. Marshall emerged from the house holding 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed her one without speaking, then settled into the old rocker. The porch creaked in familiar protest. The phone buzzed on Lucy's thigh. She glanced down. A new email notification, subject line in bold. Compliance action to be escalated, immediate visual mitigation required. You think wildflowers lower property value? Mrs. Lowe's voice shook but held steady. I think silence does worse. The Willow Creek Church Hall smelled faintly of lemon, cleaner and stronger of nerves. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum as neighbors settled in, some out of duty, some out of curiosity, a few clutching paper plates with crumbling lemon bars and lukewarm coffee in styrofoam cups. Marshall took a seat near the aisle, Lucy beside him with a manila folder across her lap. Carl fiddled with a short-throw projector near the front, his shirt collar slightly crooked and a small enamel pin catching the light whenever he moved. The ceiling fans hummed overhead, not enough to cool the tension collecting between rows of townfolk. Charlene Denning stood at the front like a schoolmarm in a courtroom. Her hair sprayed into stillness, her beige blouse pressed into submission. She tapped the microphone. We're here today, she began, to address a growing concern, disruptions to our community aesthetic integrity. Visual unity is the cornerstone of property trust and neighborhood value. Marshall didn't blink, but he did glance at the copy of the letter folded neatly in his pocket. He'd read it again this morning. The line that stuck was, cohesion over character. Ella would have underlined it in red. Charlene continued, her voice smoother than her expression. One property in particular has created confusion, unsanctioned plantings, non-regulation feeders, and intentional overgrowth. This isn't about one man. It's about all of us. Lucy raised her hand. I'd like to respond. Charlene opened her mouth to object, but the crowd shifted, turning their attention to the young woman who now stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had evidence and wasn't afraid to read it aloud. This, Lucy said, tapping the laptop Carl had just connected, is our formal certification notification from the Georgia Nature Conservancy. Preliminary Tier 2 status. Recognized native habitat with multiple pollinator support species. The screen glowed. Images of milkweed, bee balm, a monarch caterpillar on goldenrod. A scan of Ella's original plant map. The room quieted. And this, Lucy continued, is the species list. 14 verified natives. No invasives. No violations under state ecological code. Charlene's hand tightened on the podium. State code doesn't override HOA standards. Actually, Lucy said gently, in pollinator preservation zones, it can. Carl stood beside the projector, scrolling through the images. My birdbath was sited last fall, he said. They called it a reflective hazard. It's a metal bowl on bricks. The only thing it reflects is the blue sky. Laughter bubbled from the back. Mrs. Lowe stood next. You find me for echinacea. Said it looked tired. My husband and I planted those together for 20 years. He passed. I didn't touch the bed that spring. Silence rolled through the room, softer than wind but heavier than stone. Charlene cleared her throat, voice higher now. We all make sacrifices for community. No exceptions. Brayton muttered something about sacrificing common sense, and a few heads nodded. Then Charlene snapped. This garden, she said, pointing at the screen, is an ecological distraction. It draws attention, violates cohesion, and if necessary, I will invoke emergency override protocol under Article 9C. Gasps. Someone dropped a lemon bar. Mr. Hollins, seated beside the punch bowl, stiffened. That's meant for flood zones and fire mitigation. Charlene pressed forward. Neglect spreads. Wildness invites disorder. If we allow one yard to dictate terms, we lose the unity that brought us here. Lucy stepped forward. Maybe unity isn't supposed to mean sameness. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft whirl of the projector's fan. Charlene gathered her papers with stiff fingers and snapped the laptop shut. This isn't a debate, she said, and stormed toward the rear exit. The folding chairs whispered as neighbors shifted, murmured, turned to each other, not in anger, but in unease. For the first time, they weren't sure which side they were sitting on. Marshall remained seated, hands folded on his cane. The meeting dissolved slowly around him, voices rising, footsteps scattering. Mr. Hollins passed by on his way out, pausing just long enough to slip a folded sticky note into Marshall's hand. Marshall opened it under the dim hallway light. Check Q1 ledger. Unapproved line items. Lucy blinked at the spreadsheet. 3 entries. Same date. All listed as seasonal enhancement, $2,100. She squinted closer, her index finger hovering just above the faded screen of Marshall's old laptop. The numbers lined up too neatly, the descriptions vague in a way that made her stomach tighten. Marshall sat across the table, the soft hum of the dishwasher filling the gaps between their breaths. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon soap and old paper, traces of Ella's meticulous world lingering in every drawer and binder. He reached for his mug, lifted it, then set it down again without sipping. Tea-stained rings circled the tabletop like quiet exclamations. I used to joke, he said softly, that beautification sounded like a polite way to misfile money. Lucy didn't laugh. She opened another file, this one a scanned copy from the monthly budget binder, Ella's old system, still intact and alphabetized beneath the phone books. Carl had found it earlier and declared it vintage accountability. On cue, Carl walked back into the kitchen holding his third lemon cookie, thumb swiping across his phone. Okay, this vendor, Harmony Seasonal Concepts, has no physical address. But cross-checking the name shows it's linked to Green Harmony Landscaping, which lists a P.O. box at Willow Mini Storage. Unit C. He paused to chew. Also, the listed phone number loops into a disconnected voicemail with a robot voice that says, mailbox full. That's basically financial code for hide and run. Marshall raised his eyebrows. Mr. Hollins had come by an hour earlier with a printed ledger in a brown envelope. I thought you ought to see this, he'd said, voice low, eyes scanning the quiet neighborhood. Now that very ledger lay open on the kitchen table, surrounded by post-it notes, receipts, and the kind of determined silence that meant something was about to shift. Lucy tapped the keyboard again. Same vendor under different aliases. All listed on the same dates, billed for things like seasonal aesthetic refreshment, eco-balance consultation, and my personal favorite, visual rebalancing. Carl snorted. That's just someone trimming hedges and calling it art. Marshall opened the drawer beside him, pulled out Ella's last yellow notepad, and began listing the entries by hand. The scratch of his pen filled the room with an energy that felt like both memory and momentum. Outside, the porch light buzzed faintly. A breeze stirred the lavender near the back window. Carl looked up briefly. I can call a friend who works freelance tech for Green South Weekly. If we frame it as a pattern, not an accusation, she might pass it up the chain. Lucy nodded. Let's write it like Ella would've. They stayed at the table until after 10. Carl pulled PDFs from the HOA's member portal. Lucy combed through invoice structures. Marshall double-checked names, circled dates, added footnotes. The kitchen clock ticked over slowly, the hum of the dishwasher now a background purr of persistence. By 10:42, the report was done, Community Spending Irregularity Overview, Willow Creek HOA Q1 and Q2. 8 pages, 3 tables, 2 vendor trace summaries, and a note at the bottom in Marshall's handwriting, submitted in good faith for public record and community clarity. He printed it on Ella's old inkjet printer, the one that moaned before it spit anything out. Then he signed it. Twice. Lucy sealed one envelope for the county clerk's office. Marshall handed her a second. This one goes to the paper, he said. The next morning, the phone rang. Lucy picked up first. Mr. Quinn? A woman's voice asked. This is Maya from Green South Weekly. We'd like to run your report in our Sunday edition. Center spread. Would you prefer we use your name, or quote you anonymously? Marshall took the phone. He paused, looking toward the lavender outside. You can print it. Just spell Ella's name right in the byline. At 6:45 a.m., the front page fluttered in the diner window breeze. HOA funds questioned in Willow Creek, residents demand answers. The headline was printed in bold black ink, just above a color photo of Ella's garden gate, lavender spilling over the stone border, a honeybee frozen mid-hover. Below it, the subhead read, Unapproved expenses, duplicate vendors, and growing calls for reform. Inside Sweet Magnolia Diner, the regulars weren't reading, they were passing the paper around like it was hot cornbread. The coffee was stronger than usual, the murmurs louder, and the booth cushions had never squeaked so much from shifting weight. Marshall sat in his usual spot by the window, mug in hand. Lucy was beside him, sipping sweet tea with quiet satisfaction, her lips hiding the hint of a grin. The sunlight hit the table just right, catching the steam rising from her glass and the corner of the article Maya had highlighted in red. Brayton flipped through his copy at the counter. Says right here, $6, $300 spent on aesthetic consultation across 3 shadow vendors. All traced back to a P.O. box behind the bait shop. He shook his head. My daffodils could have told them for free. Carl strolled in wearing his usual cargo shorts and a smug look. 23,000 views overnight, he said, tapping his phone. And that's not counting the reposts. #HOA Gone Wild is trending in 3 states. From behind the register, Pearl muttered, if her mascara ran any faster, it'd have passed the vote already. The bell above the diner door jingled. Maya Chin entered with her reporter's notebook already open and a red pen tucked behind her ear. She wore boots and purpose and headed straight for Marshall's booth. Mind if I sit? She asked. Marshall gestured to the empty side with a slight nod. We're not finished rewriting history yet. Maya smiled. Perfect. Let's start with the ledger. Back at the HOA hall, Charlene Denning pushed open the doors with more force than necessary. Her heels struck the tile like accusations, and her clipboard was already loaded with fresh printouts. But the board table wasn't full. 2 chairs sat empty. Mr. Hollins stood quietly in the corner, arms crossed. What's going on? She snapped. Where's Stephanie? Where's Caleb? Didn't say, Hollins replied. Charlene stormed to the front of the room, unrolling her talking points with trembling fingers. The walls buzzed faintly with the hum of old fluorescent lights and rising indignation. Within minutes, neighbors filed in. Carl had started a live stream. Maya slipped into the back unnoticed, pen ready. Lucy stood near the exit, arms folded, watching the tension bend like a branch under wind. Charlene cleared her throat. I've called this emergency session to address misinformation. The article circulating contains mischaracterizations and unsupported data. No wrongdoing has occurred. A hand shot up. Mrs. Lowe. Did you or did you not approve $4,200 for visual harmony upkeep with no receipts? Charlene's jaw tightened. The board authorized expenditures as needed for the community aesthetic. And were those board members related to you? Carl called out, his phone still steady. A ripple of laughter. Charlene's face reddened. You think weeds make you noble? She snapped, turning toward Marshall. You think ignoring guidelines and hiding behind vines is activism? You're weaponizing nostalgia. You're undermining the order I built. Maya scribbled faster. Marshall stood but said nothing. He didn't need to. The room was already leaning away from her. You're fence-sitters, Charlene continued, voice rising. All of you. I tried to keep this neighborhood clean, respectable. And instead, Lucy said quietly, you kept it afraid. Charlene's voice cracked. I built this order. She turned too fast, her heel catching the edge of a folding chair. Her clipboard slipped, clattering to the floor. A lemon bar, half-eaten, someone else's snack, smeared beneath her foot as she stormed out. The glass door slapped shut behind her. Nobody followed. Carl angled his phone toward the table, catching the clipboard where it had fallen, the pages now scattered like leaves in a too-perfect yard. Back at the diner, Lucy refreshed her inbox. A new email popped up. Subject, Community Motion to Dissolve Willow Creek HOA, vote scheduled May 7th. Sunlight filtered through Marshall's porch vines as a brass plaque gleamed. Harland Legacy Habitat, Tier 2 certified. It caught the light just right, like Ella's wind chimes used to when the breeze came off the woods. Beneath the sign, a garland of native wildflowers draped across the railing, handwoven by a pair of second graders from Maple Elementary. The porch was full. Folding chairs unfolded. Pies cooled on picnic tables. And laughter floated up like birdsong through the garden. It was May 14th, Wild Yards Day. Not a national holiday, yet, but in Willow Creek, it had more meaning than any parade. Marshall sat under the dogwood in his favorite rocker, the one with the worn armrest and Ella's initials still carved faintly into the side. He watched as Lucy led a group of kids through the backyard, pointing at milkweed, black-eyed Susans, and a raised bed labeled Pollinator Cafe. A little boy asked if the bees paid for their food. Lucy answered, "They pay in magic," and didn't even flinch. Near the picnic tables, Carl wrangled a camera on a tripod while trying to balance a glass of homemade lemonade. "We'll start rolling in 5, he called, unless someone trips over the extension cord again. Mrs. Lowe had brought ginger tea and a basket of rosemary cuttings. Brayton, dressed in a pressed shirt and a suspiciously clean baseball cap, offered to grill hot dogs but got distracted explaining native mulch to a group of curious teens. Mr. Hollins passed out programs titled From Finds to Flowers, The Story of Ella's Garden. Under a pop-up tent, a Nature Conservancy rep stood beside a newly installed wooden sign. It read, "Preserved by law, loved by community." She shook Marshall's hand with both of hers. "Your wife started something rare," she said. "You all made sure it didn't vanish." Marshall only nodded. His eyes had gone damp, and he didn't trust his voice just yet. Lucy returned to the porch with a clipboard and wide eyes. "You ready?" Carl gave the thumbs up. She stood before the camera, Georgia's sunlight warming her face, garden buzzing behind her. "My name is Lucy Quinn," she said. "And this is what happens when people listen to land, and to each other." The recording ended with a slow pen over Ella's old planter beds, the faded tags still hanging like quiet footnotes. Lucy exhaled and tucked her speech back into her pocket. Half an hour later, her phone rang. Carl read the caller ID and nudged her. "Georgia State?" She answered, turned away for privacy, then spun back around with eyes wide and shining. "Full fellowship," she said. "Environmental planning. Fall semester." Mrs. Lowe clapped. Carl hooped. Marshall reached into his pocket and handed her Ella's old sun hat. "Might need this more than I do now." Later that afternoon, as guests began to drift home, Marshall stayed behind. He moved slowly across the porch, a carved plank under his arm. It smelled like cedar and patience. He knelt beside the steps and screwed it in gently, just beside the new Conservancy sign. Ella's Wild Garden, legacy grown, not mowed. Beside it, he placed the sun hat, soft, frayed, and full of memory. A small girl in a yellow sundress approached. "Mr. Marshall," she asked, "is this your yard?" He smiled. "We don't own the land," he said. "We just keep it safe till it can speak again." As the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, casting golden lines across the lavender, Carl captured one last frame. Just outside the now-abandoned HOA office, where the windows still bore the shadow of signs long taken down, a single dandelion pushed through the cracked sidewalk, steady, bright, and utterly untamed. Sunlight touched every corner of the garden that day, not just the blossoms, but the quiet resolve that had taken root between neighbors, among the vines, and in memories kept alive. What began with a warning letter ended with folded chairs under dogwoods, laughter among sun hats, and the kind of truth that grows when people stop being afraid. When rules serve power alone, communities fracture, but when they're reclaimed by purpose and love, even the smallest yard can become sacred ground. Perhaps it's never too late to protect what matters, to stand steady with those around you, and to let kindness bloom louder than control. Like a lantern in a quiet window, one honest voice can guide a whole street home.